Even though I've been a priest for about 10 years or so, to be honest, I don't think I've ever preached before about the story of the man born blind, which you find in the Gospel of John, chapter 11. And truth be told, I don't think I've even heard a homily, at least live, on this particular subject. So I don't know how that's actually possible, but that's the situation, and I guess it is what it is. I'd imagine that for most people, when they preach on this subject, they talk about the reality of evil and suffering in this world, if only because of how the story actually begins. And so, kind of a quick recap, there's this man who's obviously born blind. The Lord heals him before finally revealing himself to this man at the very end of the story. But at the very beginning of the story, the Lord's disciples posed to him a question. Why was this man born blind to begin with? Was it because of something that he did or something that his parents did? So obviously they're working on this early Old Testament understanding that the only reason why illness or some sort of physical ailment afflicts a particular person in their life is because of personal sin. Personal sin on the part of themselves or someone in their family tree. But of course the Lord responds by saying to them, neither. The reason why this man was born blind was neither because of his sin or because of his parents' sin. Rather, he was born blind such that God's works might be revealed through him. Which speaks to the fact that if God permits any sort of evil or suffering to exist in the context of this world, it is always to bring about a greater good. Or to put it more poetically in the words of St. Paul, all things work together for the good for those who love the Lord. Now that said, that's all I really want to say about that. I don't really want to get into the subject of evil and suffering more than I already have. And so what I want to focus on instead is the subject of evangelization. And I realize that might sound kind of strange on the face of it, but if you think about it, in the context of this gospel, again, the story of the man born blind, it is actually a recurring theme that you find up and down the course of the narrative. Because, of course, in the aftermath of the healing of this man, what does he do? He goes forth to evangelize his peers. And it's not an intellectually based sort of evangelization, so he's not going about trying to do apologetics with the people of God, but instead he focuses on doing evangelization on a very basic level. So it's evangelization on a level of witness and encounter. Let me tell you, or let me give witness to the fact that I was encountered by the one living and true God who touched my heart and changed my life. And again, that's what he's sharing with the people in his immediate circumstances. But you see, what's interesting is how the people respond. How do the people of God respond to this man's kind of modest efforts towards evangelization? Not well. They respond with indifference, rejection, and in some cases, outright hostility. And so, for example, a lot of his friends and neighbors don't even acknowledge that this was the same guy. Is this the guy that we knew? Is this the guy that we actually grew up with? Even his parents don't really back him up. So afraid are they of the scribes and the Pharisees. And the scribes and the Pharisees themselves, after asking this man the same questions over and over again, simply because they don't like the answer that he's giving, eventually kick him out of the temple. They exclude him from the place of public worship. But you see, here's the thing. Despite the indifference of the people, despite their rejection, despite their hostility, was this man in fact faithful in terms of doing and saying everything that God wanted him to do in this particular circumstance? And therefore, was God pleased by how he basically played the game? Yes, and definitely yes. Which speaks to the fact that here's a man who successfully collaborates with the grace of God, the grace of conversion, despite the apparent failure of the mission. Now, I realize that might sound kind of strange and almost kind of counterintuitive, but it's actually a recurring theme that you find up and down the history of Christendom itself. And so think, for example, of the words of St. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who very famously says, "You are called not to be successful, but to be faithful." Or think about St. Bernadette of Lourdes, who is questioned by the local civil authorities who don't believe her when she gives testimony to the reality of these visions of Our Lady of Lourdes. They say to her, "Look, we don't believe you," in response to which she says, "I didn't come to convince you, I came to tell you." So saith this simple little girl from the small village of Lourdes. Or think perhaps of the example of the Lord himself. And so even though there are clearly various instances in the gospel of people experiencing immediate conversion in the immediate aftermath of the Lord's teaching and preaching and the various workings of his miracles, at the same time, how does the Lord actually end his life, at least in a very natural sense? He ends his life with tragedy, rejection, and suffering and death. And yet, in the words of the prophet Isaiah, "By his wounds we are healed." It is precisely through the Lord's suffering and death on the cross that salvation is brought to the world. In a certain sense, it's the very crux of the Christian thing. Okay, now at this point, I kind of want to further illustrate the point by using two slightly more contemporary examples. One from the life of St. Maximilian Kolbe, and the other one, well, we'll get to that in a second. And so basically, Maximilian Kolbe has this really great quote whereby he says, "God will never call you to answer for something that you did out of obedience. Now, clearly, if you think about it, Maximilian Kolbe is contemplating more kind of conventional and traditional relationships of obedience, if you will, whether we're talking about relationships with the Pope or bishops or teachers, employers, or parents, for example, if you're a minor living at home, right? So again, what he's saying is that if you act out of obedience in those particular relationships, short of a direct command to violate the various norms of the moral life, of course, God will never call you to answer for the things that you did. He might invite the other people to answer for what they did, but that's a homily for a different day. But again, he will never call you to answer for the things that you did if you acted out of obedience in the context of those particular relationships. But you see, the thing I want to impress upon you is that the same principle actually applies when it comes to our relationship with God. And so let's say, for example, you're going about your life, you're trying to kind of facilitate the work of evangelization. You're trying to evangelize the people in your immediate circumstance. And you pray into it and you realize that the Lord is actually calling you to focus on ordinary stuff. Do your work carefully and well. Attend to the duty of prayer. Pray before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. Spend quality time with your friends, your family, your spouse, your kids, and go to bed on time. If you realize that the Lord is calling you to do that and you correspond to those various duties of the moment, despite the more kind of flashy and exciting things that you could do in the context of your life, not only will the Lord not call you to answer for the things that you did in obedience to his will, but in fact it's quite the opposite. You're actually participating more effectively with the work of salvation. Because the whole point is that when it comes to the work of evangelization, when it comes to collaborating with God's grace in this regard, it's not really about doing flashy things. It's not about even doing the most challenging thing or the most difficult thing. It is rather about being faithful to the will of God as it is revealed to us in the context of the duty of the moments, as it unfolds in the context of the simple and the humble and the ordinary. Okay, one final note, and I'll kind of end with this. And so besides being a huge movie buff, I'm actually a really big hockey fan. But truth be told, my interest in hockey is not so much in watching the thing, but in actually reading about hockey. And I realize that might sound kind of strange, but my interest in hockey is limited to the human interest stories. Like, what does sports teach us about living the human life, right? So it's not so much about the spectacle of the thing, but it's about reading about the analogy of sports. The other thing I want to confess, though, is that because I'm from Vancouver, I'm not really a Leafs fan, right? So I'm not really a huge fan of the Toronto Maple Leafs. I'm more of a Vancouver Canucks fan, which obviously has its own challenges. But more to the point, the example I'm going to use today involves both the Leafs and the Canucks. So we both win, right? Anyways, as the story goes, before the 2008-2009 season, the Vancouver Canucks made an offer to Matt Sundin, who was obviously the former captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs, to play for them for one season for the cool price of $10 million. And the thinking was that besides still being a really good player, Matt Sundin could teach the younger cohort of stars in the Vancouver Canucks stable, led by these two guys, Daniel and Henrik Sedin, to take that next step in their development, to transition from being simply stars to becoming superstars in the NHL. But what's interesting is that Matt Sundin, despite again receiving this huge offer to play for the Vancouver Canucks, didn't immediately play for the team right away. But instead, he joined them kind of partway through the season, I believe at game 41. And when he joined them, he struggled a lot at first, for a whole variety of factors. His age, the fact that everyone else was in kind of mid-season form, and the fact that he was kind of joining a new team, right? As a result of which, the Vancouver media was really harsh, questioning the Vancouver Canucks organization, the logic of the decision, questioning Matt Sundin. But what's interesting is that in the midst of all this, Matt Sundin didn't allow himself to get overly flustered. But instead, he just stuck with it. He was just faithful to the process. Until finally, after several months, when the team finally arrived at the playoffs, he was actually the best player on the team. And it just so happens that years later, both Daniel and Henrik Sedin, they had this interview with the local Vancouver media. And what they said was that for them, this was the turning point in their careers. This year they had with Matt Sundin, a single year where they played with him, that was a turning point where they learned to become real superstars in the NHL. Because they reflected on the experience and they said, well, gosh, back when we were young, whenever things weren't going well, like whether individually or on a team level, they would always give in to the temptation to change things, to deviate from the plan, to deviate from the structure, if only because they weren't experiencing immediate results. But what they learned from Matt Sundin in that particular year was that sometimes you just got to stick with it. Sometimes there's all sorts of external noise in terms of your immediate circumstances, but again, sometimes you got to stick with it, be faithful to the process, and realize that real, authentic, and lasting change often takes place over a long period of time, and that's just the way it is. And again, the thing I want to impress upon you is that the same principle actually applies when it comes to the spiritual life, and in particular to the subject of evangelization. Because even though it's true that you should certainly be open to changing to better collaborate with God's grace, the grace of conversion, however you want to frame it, If you pray into it in the appropriate way, what you'll realize, perhaps only in retrospect, is that if God is calling you to change, He's only calling you to change in very small and incremental sort of ways. And for the most part, He's actually calling you to focus on being faithful to Him, again, in the context of the duty of the moments. Because again, we gotta be mindful of the fact that long, authentic, and lasting change typically takes place over a long period of time. And perhaps more to the point, at the end of the day, what is it that we want to offer the Lord? Not so much a great plethora of things that we did or accomplished, but the very simple and precious fruits of a well-ordered life. Such that we might finally be able to say to the Lord at the very end of our lives, not so much here's what I've done, but rather this is the person I've finally become. And you see, the thing I want to impress upon you is that that's the sort of mentality which will ultimately change your life for the better. That's the sort of mentality that will ultimately change the world. And may God bless you all.